Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are decoding what is honestly a massive geopolitical earthquake hiding right in plain sight, the UAE's strategic exit from OPEC. Now, leaving a super powerful cartel right in the middle of a global crisis? Yeah, that probably sounds totally counterintuitive. But as we'll see, the structural and geopolitical data actually reveals a pretty masterful stroke of timing. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is how we're going to break it down. First, the perfect time to leave. Second, the oil quota math. Third, the geopolitical fracture. Fourth, OPEC's spare capacity problem. And finally, the advantage for India.
All right, jumping straight into Section 1, the perfect time to leave, a closing window.
So, here is the central paradox we need to unpack. Why on earth would a major oil producer pick a moment of profound regional instability to just walk away from the world's most powerful energy alliance? Usually, right, in a crisis, you hunker down with your allies. But the UAE? Well, they clearly saw a closing window of opportunity.
And the answer to that paradox lies right here. The Strait of Hormuz is currently under a blockade due to the ongoing conflict. Now, to put that in perspective, this is a massive choke point where a full one-fifth of the world's global crude oil usually transits. And because of this blockade, along with all the ongoing assaults on shipping and infrastructure, the normal rules of the game, they are completely suspended. Think about it for a second. If the UAE left OPEC under normal conditions, the cartel could totally punish them. They could drop the price floor, flood the market, maybe isolate them politically. But right now, none of those penalties actually apply. OPEC literally cannot flood the market because the crude literally cannot get through the strait. So this crisis has essentially neutralized the entire cost of defecting.
Moving on to Section 2, the oil quota math, financial friction.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really fundamental asymmetry between these players. So a country's break-even price is just the minimum oil price they need to balance their national budget. The UAE sits very comfortably at around $50 a barrel. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, OPEC's de facto leader, they need roughly $80 to $90. So ultimately, the UAE was essentially subsidizing a high-price floor that it absolutely didn't even need. They were artificially holding back their own economy just to keep their higher-cost neighbors profitable.
Which brings us to this incredibly staggering number, $1.36 million. That is the exact number of barrels per day that the UAE would be forced to leave completely underutilized by January 2026 under OPEC's really strict quota rules. See, the UAE has invested a whopping $150 billion to ramp up its national production capacity to 5 million barrels a day. But OPEC's rules, they were going to cap them at around 3.4 million. And, well, you simply do not spend $150 billion on infrastructure just to let a massive chunk of it sit there doing absolutely nothing. The UAE's ambitions had fundamentally outgrown OPEC's constraints.
Let's look a little deeper in Section 3, the geopolitical fracture, a shifting worldview. We can actually map out exactly how this historical bedrock cracked by looking at some objective data points over time. Back pre-2020, Saudi Arabia launched its Vision 2030 initiative. This redirected foreign investment and essentially turned these two historic allies into really fierce economic competitors. Then, in 2020, the UAE signs the Abraham Accords, right? They formalize ties with Israel and carve out this distinctly independent foreign policy identity. Fast forward to late 2025, and their shared military coalition in Yemen completely collapses into open friction. And then, the real kicker in 2026, Washington explicitly demands lower oil prices in exchange for continued military protection in the Gulf. So step by step, the UAE and Saudi Arabia just found themselves on completely irreversibly divergent paths.
Let's neutrally contrast where they both stand now. On one side, the UAE can easily afford lower oil prices, and they have already secured independent strategic value with Washington through those Abraham Accords. But on the other side, Saudi Arabia structurally needs higher prices, which obviously creates a lot of friction when trying to meet U.S. demands. By leaving the cartel, the UAE is perfectly positioned to meet the American demand for lower prices. And by doing that, they cement their own strategic and security value in Washington, totally independent of those old Gulf solidarity frameworks.
Let's see how this all builds in Section 4. OPEC's spare capacity problem, existential crisis.
To really understand the structural damage here, we have to define a super crucial concept, and that is spare capacity. Basically, this is the amount of excess oil production that a country can turn on very quickly to absorb a shock to the global supply. Say there's a war or a natural disaster.
Spare capacity is what you use to flood the market and stabilize those prices. For OPEC, spare capacity isn't just a nice little buffer, it is literally their core enforcement mechanism. It's the big stick they wave around to maintain market credibility and punish anybody who disobeys their quotas.
Now, OPEC Plus controls a massive 41% of the global oil supply. And sure, that looks incredibly powerful on a chart, but their real power doesn't actually come from the oil they are currently pumping. It relies entirely on that spare capacity buffer they hold in reserve. And right now, they are absolutely hemorrhaging that exact capability.
What we are actually witnessing is a cascading loss of control. Step 1. Angola walked out in 2024 over quota disputes, which basically proved to everyone that you could leave and survive. Step 2. Kazakhstan flagrantly breached its quotas by hundreds of thousands of barrels in early 2026, and OPEC couldn't even stop them. Step 3. The UAE leaves, and this takes 1.36 million barrels per day of actionable spare capacity entirely out of the OPEC framework. With Saudi Arabia's own capacity currently slashed in half due to wartime export troubles, the cartel has, quite suddenly, lost its teeth. It can no longer credibly stabilize the global market or threaten defectors.
Zooming out to the global ripple effect in Section 5, the advantage for India. Global ripple effects.
So, the crucial point to take away from all this is understanding how the timeline shifts for major oil importing nations. In the short term, yeah, things are definitely tough. The Hormuz blockade is creating an emergency supply squeeze, it's surging war risk premiums, and hiking import prices. That is just pure pain for huge importers like India. But look at the medium term. Once the dust settles, you have a free and completely unbound UAE capable of pumping its maximum 5 million barrels per day. Without OPEC's rules standing in the way, countries like India can now just bypass the cartel entirely. They can negotiate massive bilateral high-volume deals directly with the UAE. This completely recalibrates the entire global supply chain, shifting a major strategic advantage heavily toward major Asian importers.
Which brings us to this incredibly apt quote from Robin Mills at Kamar Energy, who was analyzing this exact data. He said, "If there is a time to leave, now is the time." It just perfectly encapsulates the UAE's calculated strategic calculus. They looked at a blocked strait, an unneeded price floor, a fracturing alliance, and a changing global market, and they decided to make the ultimate strategic pivot.
And that leaves us with this final, provocative thought. By losing the UAE, and honestly more importantly, by losing its spare capacity, OPEC has lost the very mechanism it uses to enforce its will. The Hormuz blockade didn't break OPEC. It really just accelerated an irreversible fracture that had been quietly growing for years. So, as we watch these incredible geopolitical tectonic plates shift, we really have to ask, is this the definitive death of OPEC's market credibility? It is an absolutely fascinating question and one we highly encourage you to keep exploring as the data continues to roll in. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer. Keep learning, and we'll see you next time.